Hello, my name is Marina Gavrushkina, and I'm an accountant at Nolan Community Services. I also help with fundraising efforts and community outreach efforts. So I'm sitting down today with George Stevens, who is well, introduce yourself, George.
Hi, I'm George Stevens. I'm the Executive Director for the North Los Angeles County Regional Center.
It's a pretty hefty title. As the executive director, what exactly is your role at the regional center?
I have oversight of the entire regional center,
Mm-hmm.
which means I have oversight over clinical services, case management services, accounting services, resource development. My job is to make sure that the spirit of the Lanterman Act, spirit of Title 17 are all implemented to serve our consumers.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we're responsible for basically outreach. So we're reaching out to identify new applicants and new consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, North LA has probably the most consumers statewide, or applicants statewide in the intake and assessment process.
So how many is that?
Over 1,000.
Oh.
For a number of years, we were the fastest growing regional center in the state.
Mm-hmm.
We've fallen off a little bit, but the number of applicants we have in intake and assessment is still number one in the state. It's somewhere around 1,400
Mm-hmm.
when you look at early start and non-early start cases. Early start will be all those applicants under the age of 3,
Mm-hmm.
0 to 3. Non-early start are what we call Lanterman intakes. Those are individuals over the age of 3.
Yeah.
And so we have an aggressive outreach so that we can identify anyone that's potentially eligible for our services.
Mm-hmm.
So we service the San Fernando, Santa Clarita, and Antelope Valleys.
Mm-hmm.
We're literally the northern part of Los Angeles County, everything north of Mulholland Drive
Okay.
to the county lines.
Uh-huh.
That's the Ventura County line, the Kern County line, and actually San Bernardino County line.
Oh wow. So that's a really
yeah.
big area,
We're
huge
half-
population.
Yeah, geographically, we're probably a little more than half of Los Angeles County.
Mm-hmm.
We're the largest regional center in Los Angeles County
Mm-hmm.
and the third largest regional center in the state in
Wow.
terms of population served.
Yeah. It's a huge responsibility.
Yes.
So you mentioned the Lanterman Act, and but before we get into that, and that stuff is all really interesting, but I just want to ask, how did you get into this line of work? Like, what is your history? You weren't always the executive
No.
director.
Actually, it was a series of circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
to say it best. When I was applied to UCLA graduate school, I have an MSW, Master's in Social Work.
Oh.
I wanted to work in community development, and I wanted to work with children.
Mm-hmm.
And so I applied, and I was accepted. And so they have to put you in what they call a practicum, a field placement.
Mm-hmm.
And the only field placement that was available to meet my needs and also had dollars attached to it, so they were paying us to go to school,
Yeah.
was this Child Welfare Administration grant.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to receive this grant, I had to work with children, and I had to work with children in the community.
Mm-hmm.
The only resource that the school could find was a regional center.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew nothing about regional centers. You know, I just said, regional center, what's a regional center?
Yeah. Have you worked with any
Never.
people with
Just
developmental disabilities?
Never. I was actively working with children that were underprivileged, so just use the word. So basically, this was really new for me. I was being placed at Harbor Regional Center in Torrance, and I actually lived out in the San Fernando Valley at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was at UCLA, so I hopped into my car, and I drove down the 405, bumper to bumper traffic. And I drive out to the backside of Harbor General Hospital, and I locate this trailer, a double wide, and that was the regional center.
Oh wow. What year was this? That's my first thought.
1975.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my field practicum while I was in my first year at UCLA. And what we did was we developed resources.
Mm-hmm.
And my project was to work with a parent group They were called Advent. That was the name of this parent group,
Mm-hmm.
and they had young adults that they were trying to develop social outings and just help them engage in social activities in the community.
Okay.
And I was the liaison to that group, so I worked with the parents to help them become incorporated, help them develop an official
Mm-hmm.
program. I also worked with the Red Cross to develop a respite program.
Mm-hmm.
So it was good. It was at the beginning.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand all the nuances of it.
Mm-hmm.
I did have the opportunity to go out to Camarillo State Hospital. Now, it was called a developmental center later on, but at the time I first went out there, it was a state hospital. It's now Channel Islands University.
Oh, yeah. Is that Hotel California?
Well, anyway.
It has an interesting history.
Very interesting. So I went out there, and I was walking over the grounds,
Mm-hmm.
and it was quaint to say the least, but it left an impression on me that I'll never forget. And I went into the adult autism ward.
A ward. When you hear the word ward, you know
It's descriptive. It's very descriptive of what it was. I walked through the first door, and first someone has to come let you in. You ring the bell, and they let you in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a foyer, and then there's another door you go through. So if someone got through one door, you couldn't get through the other door.
Oh.
They're all locks and keys. And you walked into this large day room with a television that was located on a wall above where no one could really reach it,
Mm-hmm.
and some tattered furniture around, and people just aimlessly just walking around doing nothing.
Yeah.
Over in another room, they were working on, one staff person was working on puzzles or something, but it really wasn't age appropriate for these adults.
Yeah.
And the majority of the staff were in this kind of nursing station, with kind of glass windows on it where you can look out to see what's going on, but you're really not engaged with folks.
No, not at all.
And then behind that was another door you went through, and it was actually the sleeping quarters, and the sleeping quarters looked like army barracks. Those army barracks you see from the 40s, where you have
bunk beds?
No, there were the flat beds, but there were the beds with, they had a steel footrest, a steel headrest, or whatever, mattress, but they were all just lined up with kind of like a little locker at the bottom of them, at the foot.
Mm-hmm.
And it was literally like a ward.
Yeah.
The absence of structure, the absence of involvement left an indelible mark on me. It's just you look at it and you kind of go, people were just like herded around, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And you just kind of knew there had to be something better. So that was an experience that kind of just said, this is not how you really treat people, how people should be treated. So after that, I finished that practical experience, and I went to a family service agency and did therapy with young adults, because that's young kids. That's because that was my passion at the time. And upon graduation, they needed a job, and I saw a job announcement came to the school. It was paper. We've talked about paper today. That's how they did things. They'd hang up on the wall. So I read North Los Angeles County Regional Center is looking for a counselor. We're called counselors then. And the counselor job was in the Santa Cruz Valley, and at that time it was called Newhall. And I said, okay, well, I understand what a regional center is. I can do this, because I had the resource development experience, and I had the case management experience and the clinical experience. So I applied, and I was hired, and that was in '77.
Wow. So you brought up regional centers, and you've worked at the North LA Regional Center for a really long time. Sounds like 40
Forever.
years. 40 years?
40 years, with the exception of about 18 months when I went to Tri-Counties Regional Center.
Okay, that's.
But mainly I've been at North LA.
So could you tell the viewers a little bit about what exactly is a
Mhm.
regional center, what makes it unique, and how it came to be, how they've developed in California.
Sure. Regional centers are unique to California, so you'll only find them in California.
Mm-hmm.
The idea behind a regional center is that it's a fixed point of contact for individuals with developmental disabilities that come to throughout their lifetime for service planning.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of this fixed point of contact in the community, there was supposed to be one regional center for every million population in the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be 37 regional centers if they'd kept it up, but there's only 21.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was these would be community-based organizations that would do community outreach in terms of finding new consumers. They would also do resource development, develop a system of services within their communities.
Mm-hmm.
They would do advocacy for families and consumers throughout their lifetime. So basically, from birth to death, we were there to support people with developmental disabilities. Private nonprofit organizations, it was determined through a court action that we wouldn't be state agencies, and that the board members of regional centers, 50% need to be consumers or secondary consumers like family members. And for North LA's situation, the vast majority of the board members are family members or consumers.
Yeah.
And they're the folks that really oversee the governance of the center to ensure that we're complying with the Lanterman Act, that we're complying with the contract with the state of California, and that we're providing the needed services in this community. The board actively engages in outreach, community outreach, in terms of legislation that impacts our families and consumers, tries to influence that legislation, so it really does meet the spirit of community-based services for people. So how it came about is by family members that wanted something different. Back in the late 60s, there was somewhere around 13,000 individuals living in state hospitals or state institutions, developmental centers. Fast forward to today, I think it's down to 800. So the idea of creating a community alternative, and other than sending people outside of their community, has been a major success. The system as a whole, I believe we're serving somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000. North LA serves just under 25,000 individuals.
Wow.
And the whole idea is that people become part of their communities. They live in their communities, they work in their communities, they receive educational services in their communities. All the support's right where you are. So folks are no longer displaced.
No, not put into wards. Or
No more wards, which is a good thing.
Of course, it sounds
it's a good
like
thing. We sometimes get tied up in the everyday struggles, the everyday fights that you have to, get funding and to make sure the services are there. But if we step back for a moment and we look at the system as a whole over the last 50 years, we've come a real long ways. And I think that the founding fathers, mothers, and folks should be very proud of what they started. When you think that now, Nolan, for example, everybody lives in their own place. People live meaningful or have meaningful day services. So folks aren't just sent to a fixed point and congregate there, but they can go out and get jobs and live a life that's just like their non-disabled peer. So that's the good thing. But I think we need to be vigilant, and I think it's important that we're vigilant because this is a civil rights movement. It's about the rights of people with developmental disabilities to live in their communities and to receive services in their communities. And civil rights movements are very fragile. And if you're not vigilant, if you don't continue to advocate, if you don't continue to do consciousness raising, people then forget. And you become marginalized again. And you have to start that struggle all over. So I think it's important that all families, all consumers understand that, one, they're living on and experiencing the benefits of their forefathers, but they have to continue to carry the torch.
It's interesting that you bring that up because we talked about this with Steve Miller, and he brought up the fact that the Lanterman Act and all of the great developments that happened with regional centers, they came about because of parent advocacy. Do you think that's changed over the years? Has this form of advocacy kind of, declined or just has lost momentum since all the gains that were made?
I would say that there are still families that are active. There are still families and consumers that are actively advocate and they're involved. We have failed to engage all the families, and so there are a few families that are here but aren't involved. And our challenge is to get them involved. Our challenge is to help everyone gain an appreciation and an awareness of how we came about and what we need to do to be here, and that it's just not going to happen because it's already here. When you think about all the pressures on the state budget, all the changes that could potentially be going on in Washington, that's going to influence us. And I think it's important that people be aware of changes in healthcare, changes in federal funding that impact this system. Approximately 40% of the monies that come into the system and support it actually come from the federal government through waiver programs. And those are essential dollars because the general fund dollars alone aren't enough to sustain the services that are in place. And if we're to grow the system, if we're to continue to innovate, we continue to need financial support from not only the federal government, but from the state government.
I mean, that's very important. And we've been hearing in the news a lot lately about these proposed changes to the Affordable Care Act and cuts to Medicaid. And if those things go through, how does that affect the job that the regional centers do?
Well, we can't speak with certainty, but when you understand that California receives a lot of federal dollars through a variety of different waivers, and if these waivers are reduced, that means general fund dollars will have to replace those dollars to sustain what we're already doing. Understand that monies that come into the regional center system are part of discretionary monies from the state, like schools and prisons and public safety are like mandatory monies. But we're part of more of the discretionary side of the state. So we have to line up to say, we're important. We need to be funded. What's happening out here is essential to sustain people's lives in the community. So it does matter. And so people need to be involved.
Sounds like it. How do you get the word out? How do you get people involved? How do you create this sense of urgency and a call to action to get people out there?
We started a community engagement last year, which kind of culminated in the 50th anniversary of the Lanterman Act celebration we held. And through that community engagement, we've done a lot of work in terms of legislative advocacy, in terms of legislative trainings for families. We need to expand it. We need to make sure that we've touched everyone so they understand that they need to be involved. That not only do you have to be concerned about what's going on today with your son or daughter or yourself, but you also have to be concerned about what happens tomorrow. And the Lanterman Act, philosophically, is a promise that needs to be sustained, a promise that you can plan for tomorrow. What's happening for me today is really, really important, but tomorrow is also important. And if we don't take care of laying a foundation for tomorrow, we may not have the tomorrow that we would hope to have.
I see. Steve talked about the promise of the Lanterman Act as well. And there's this sense that with that promise made, people now see it as a guarantee. And do you think that's made people complacent about the future? About the future of services?
I would say there are no guarantees. And that if we look at recent trailer bill language that has titrated back the kinds of services that regional centers can provide, that reflects there are no guarantees.
I see. So with the Lanterman Act, the services that we provide to people, is there a push for meaningful services to really push people to integrate into their
Okay.
community, or is it just services for the sake of services?
To answer that question, you have to go back to the a major principle found in the Land Act.
Mm-hmm.
And what that principle is, and it says at the very beginning, that the state of California recognizes its responsibility to people with developmental disabilities, but it also says that people with developmental disabilities have the same rights and responsibilities
Mm-hmm.
as other individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So as a society, we all have responsibility to ourselves, our families, our communities.
Yeah.
So how do we, through our service system, help people exercise those responsibilities and rights? So services in and of themselves facilitate. Service is a vehicle to get from one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we travel with a person through their lives, or their life, how are we helping them become responsible? How are we helping them exercise their rights?
Mm-hmm.
So when we value a service, that would be a core question that I would ask. And that's going to be different for every person.
Yeah.
And it's going to be about how they choose, but yet how they show their responsibilities to each of us. In this world, I just believe that I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you. I have responsibilities to you just as I have responsibilities to my own family,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how I conduct myself, how I just live every day in this community that we have.
Yeah.
So how do we help our consumers
Mm-hmm.
exercise their rights plus their responsibilities through our service system? So as we look at services, not only do we need to know if it's meaningful, but is it really achieving the intent of responsibilities and rights?
That is a really difficult question to answer, it
Mhm.
seems, because you're right, everybody is different. So
Mhm.
how do you measure the success of services?
The quality outcomes, some are really easy to measure. If we
Mhm.
talk about work, well, does the person have a job?
Yeah.
How many hours are they working? What are they getting paid?
Uh-huh.
Where's the person living?
Mm-hmm.
Are they taking responsibility for their home?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they just living in Hotel California, as you said? And then, so let's talk about supported living.
Okay.
Supported living, a person has an opportunity to live in a place where they have control over their supports,
Mhm.
they have control over who comes in and out of their home.
Yeah.
But what's it mean to have your home? Do you clean your home? Do you cook in your home? How much can you take on in terms of your responsibilities in your home?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we all have choices about, our rooms and whatever. I would argue that, some people keep cleaner rooms than other people.
Yeah.
but that's a choice.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that there's an extreme on that too.
Yes.
So I think as we look at it, some things are qualitative,
Uh-huh.
some things are quantitative. But I would look at every individual and I would go, gee, if I'm providing a service to a young adult or,
Mhm.
or a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
what do I expect that teenager to do? What responsibilities do I expect that teenager to exercise
Yeah.
as a consequence of that service? So if I'm helping that teenager learn to navigate social situations in the community,
Mm-hmm.
well, how do you act? How do you engage with other people?
Yeah.
How do you go to McDonald's? How do you
Mhm.
hang out at the mall? Because that's cool for them to hang out at the mall.
Yeah.
Not an adult, but a teenager, they hang out at the mall. If
Uh-huh.
you're going to hang out at the mall, what do you do when you hang out at the mall?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm looking at an infant, and we basically have been arguing that work starts in infancy
Mm-hmm.
by just picking up your own room, by having small chores that you can begin to manage.
Yeah.
So you're beginning to build in responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think all of our services, all of our providers need to engage in the abilities of our folks and helping
Uh-huh.
people maximize their abilities rather than saying, well, this person has a disability and they're not able to do that. But what can they do?
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
And to the extent they can, how do they operate it? I mean, we have people that need 24-hour support.
Mm-hmm.
But within that 24 hours, they're really responsible. And they're out doing things and adding value to their community. I know a number of consumers that had lots of support, but there were really good advocates around transportation.
Uh-huh.
You know, and making sure that access got there, make sure that the buses got there. They were in the community, really trying to make a difference.
Yeah.
So maybe as we develop services and supports for people, that whole advocacy needs to be weaved in, and the responsibilities need to be weaved in.
Yeah. That does bring up the point of self-advocacy as well as advocacy on behalf of the parents and other members of the community on behalf of everybody in the community. So what are the challenges facing us now in the present day that we could really put more effort into advocating for?
Well, I'll go back and I'll say, like, all civil rights movements, you know, you have the primary person, you have secondary people, and then you have the system as a whole. We have our families and consumers that need to advocate for themselves. They need to advocate for better services, they need to advocate for better rates, but they also need to be advocating for greater access. We have community members, and we have people that are working in the community. So, you know, what is Jay Nolan doing to engage and to educate your staff? You know, then what are we doing to educate the community as a whole? You know, about rights and about community engagement for all of our consumers.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful that we're beginning to see more of our consumers in jobs throughout our community. We're starting to see more children participating in sports and other things with non-disabled children. So we're seeing more integration, but we have to keep promoting it, and we have to keep educating and making people aware. We just can't, the conversation has to be ongoing, and it can never get stale.
All right. So you talk a lot about individualized services and looking at people from an individual point of view. Everyone has their different needs, and we have to build our services around what that one person needs and wants, which sounds awesome. It sounds awesome in the theoretical point of view, but what are the challenges of getting to that point? I mean, you as an executive director at this regional center, how do you balance the needs of one person with the needs of the thousands of people that you support?
That's a very complex question, and I think you pull back, and we have to believe in the IPP process.
And what is that exactly?
That's the individual programming planning process. It really is person-centered planning process that really sits down with each individual and talks about what they need to do to meet their goals and their aspirations. And so we have 23,000, 24,000 IPPs that are all important. And each IPP and each person has that IPP right, which it's incumbent upon me to make sure they're able to exercise. And so the collective is, do we have policies and procedures that are in place to make sure that there's guidelines for this to work? And then on an individual basis, I need to ensure that each of my staff understands their responsibility to the individual to develop their IPP, you know, and take that IPP where that person wants to go. And that's where you get really complex, because basically, you know, for children, the parents are their primary advocates and are helping guiding and shaping, you know, where they're going to go. As adults, it gets really complex, especially for those adults that want to self-advocate and those adults that are unconserved. And even for conserved adults, they have rights also too. And it's understanding and being sensitive and of parental responsibilities, and that those responsibilities never end. I mean, as a parent and of two adult men, my involvement with my children, my sons, is still there. You know, we still offer direction and guidance. We haven't abandoned them, but yet we have to respect that they have their own decision making. And there's times we agree, and there's sometimes we disagree, and it's how we communicate with one another. The hard thing is when a person has a disability and there's a perception that the person can't self-advocate or has an awareness to make their own decisions.
Mm-hmm. And is that when the parents take over, and what is your role in it?
It's trying to create an environment where people can have a discussion.
Uh-huh.
Because I don't think you ever want to estrange the family, but you also need to respect the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how you find that balance. I think every one of us has gone through some growth and maturation with our parents.
That's true.
I don't think any of us are going to sit here and go, it was really smooth. Mom and dad want to take care of you, want to make sure you're safe, and want to make sure that everything's going to be good for you.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to take risk, and you want to be out on your own, and it's how you begin to negotiate that.
Yeah, the push and the pull.
Yeah. And so you can't ignore it. It's part of life. It's part of the dynamics and the challenges of how we as individuals begin to, again, exercise those rights and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And the consequences of exercising those rights and responsibilities, and how you mitigate extreme consequences, but allow people to understand, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And I could be wrong, I could be right, but it's your choice.
Yeah.
So, risk-taking is okay.
Mm-hmm.
As parents, we have to kind of back up sometimes and allow our sons and daughters to take measured risk.
Mm-hmm.
Even within people with developmental disabilities, they have to take measured risk. We take a risk when we let our kids ride their bicycles for the first time. Put a helmet on them and stay out of the street, ride on the sidewalk, but it's a risk.
Mm-hmm.
We take a risk when we let them jump into the swimming pool.
Yeah.
So, or go out on a date or drive a car. These are all risk. And
Mm-hmm.
it's about measuring those risks and helping people understand how to take care of themselves. Part of our responsibility as a society, as a regional center, as a provider organization, is to do risk management with our consumers.
Yeah.
Safe relationships. How do you not get exploited?
Uh-huh.
How do you protect yourself in the community when you're out?
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage your money? All of these things are part of that growing up, part of that maturation and becoming self-actualized.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no answer. It's all a process.
Yeah.
And it's all a path that each person has to go down. The failure to go down the path has detrimental consequences, because that ends up with people fighting with one another,
Mm-hmm.
and families becoming estranged
Yeah.
from their sons and daughters. The good thing, if you go down the path and you work it out, ideally, it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah. That sounds like the best course of action.
Yeah.
What is your, as the regional center, what is the regional center's role in the decision making? Like, do you mediate parents and consumers' wishes? How are you involved in that process?
You would encourage people to talk and to communicate. From time to time, there's situations where, consumers have actually exercised their rights and, want to be independent from their families.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to respect that, and you have to respect their rights, because that is their right. You would hope that we've talked to them about family, but sometimes it doesn't work out as you would want it to.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, our responsibility is to our consumers.
Yeah. So we've talked about individualized
Mm-hmm.
services. Could you tell us a little bit more about self-determination and
Sure.
what that means?
I look at it in two ways. There's the statutory way of looking at it, and then there's the humanistic way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the humanistic way of looking at it.
Yeah.
We're all engaged in self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
Everything we do, every decision we make, is us determining what we want for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that needs to be respected as a core value.
Mm-hmm.
Where you want to live, where you want to work, who you want to socialize with.
Yeah.
That's all part of us being self-determined. I mean, every adult, that's the premise of this country, our independence, our ability to make our own decisions. I think if you start with that as a basic premise, that you should be able to do and act in a responsible manner exercising your rights and responsibilities. That's the core of self-determination. Now we come over to the statute and what's written down in terms of people having more control over the services and the supports that they receive.
Yeah.
But what comes there too is responsibility and rights.
Mm-hmm.
In either scenario, if the system is working for an individual, you're going to end up with potentially the same results.
Mm-hmm.
And if I go back and I look at the history of the system and I look at supported living, that was one first attempt at self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
People said, I don't want to be in a group home.
Yeah.
Okay, so the system was flexible enough to move in that direction. I don't want to be in a workshop, I want a job.
Yeah.
The system's been more flexible.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, in what system of supports will we have the greatest flexibility and the greatest choice?
Yeah.
And that's for individuals to decide whether I have control over the budget and go that way, or whether, I go through the service system and go that way.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we would argue and that we would fight for, no matter what choice people made, that they can become self-actualized and receive the service and supports that they need to meet their needs, whether they have control over it themselves or they ask for more support to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So neither one is better or worse. It's a preference that people need to exercise.
And it goes back to the individual choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody's different.
Exactly. And we don't know what kind of constraints are going to be placed on the self-determination system because we haven't seen everything just yet. It's going to be nice to see when it comes out.
Yeah.
We need to fight to relieve some of the constraints that they've placed on regional centers and our ability to serve our consumers. And constraints to me are things like median rates, the prohibited services such as camp, social rec. To me, those were important things for families and important things for consumers. Median rates have crimped our ability to expand the system. But again, if I have a budget and my budget understates what I really need or what I can buy, I mean, if something's going to cost $100 and I'm giving $50, then
you're not going to meet that.
I can't close that gap unless I have extra resources. So, somehow we need to close the economic gap, which exists in terms of buying appropriate services, whether it's in self-determination or in regional center buying it, because I don't believe that we're able to pay the rates and the dollars that are necessary to really provide the level of services that are really needed by our consumers.
Yeah.
I think we underfund our service providers. That's why you guys do all this fundraising, because the rates aren't there. So if the rates were better, you wouldn't do the fundraising. Or if you did fundraising, it would be for other things rather than meeting core issues. So
that is very important because you hear about the minimum wage going up in Los Angeles and in California. We just hit the $12 on July 1st for, I think it's LA County.
LA County and LA City.
LA County. So the rates that providers get, have those been adjusted for that change, or is there things that need to be done on the legislative basis to get us to that point and get our budget to the point where we can provide meaningful services to people who need them?
The minimum rate is a very complex issue. I mean, it's simple from the perspective that the state should allow regional centers to adjust our provider rates reflective of the cost of doing business. I mean, that's clear to me. It's complex because the state of California has its minimum rate process and local agencies has theirs. And I think what's making it difficult is the state has decided that it wasn't going to support local minimum wage.
But why?
yeah, it does. So basically, what remains is you as a provider or the provider community is forced to pay the minimum wage because you're doing business in this county of Los Angeles or the city of Los Angeles. The regional center has no viable way of making up that wage gap. But on top of that wage gap, there's a compression issue. And the compression issue is the people that you bring on that you really can't afford to bring on because you're not being reimbursed to bring them on, their wages are becoming closer to the people that have already been there.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you have people with experience and you have people with no experience receiving the same wage.
Mm-hmm.
And then the double whammy in California is that you're required, I think, by statute to pay twice minimum wage for your exempt staff.
Mm.
So it has this kind of rippling effect through the organization.
Yeah.
So that's when I begin to talk about the complexities. It's more than just, can I pay them in wage? But it's really, can we pay the cost of doing business?
Mm-hmm.
Now, AB 279 addresses just the min wage, which is good, and we need it, and we need to advocate for that. And our regional center in North LA is behind it, and the board supports it, and I'll give testimony on it. But the reality of it is, if we're not able to adjust the overall rate system to reflect the impact of min wage, we don't address the compression issue, nor do we address the twice min wage for your exempt staff.
Yeah.
And then I think at some point you have more turnover because people become kind of like disenchanted because wait a minute, I've been here for 5 years. You just hired this new person, they're making the same thing that I'm making.
Yeah.
And
people don't want to hear that.
Right. It's a significant financial struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Those providers that have a lot of staff are going to be hit really hard.
Yeah.
And somehow they're going to have to make it up, and it's not something you can avoid.
No, it seems like it's just looming around the corner.
Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about the stability of the system, and we talk about how do we stabilize the system, I know that there's a rate study that's being done, and the results of the rate study are due to the legislature in March of 2019. But it's more than that. There has to be a way of creating a sustainable rate system. And unless we can do a sustainable rate system, even if I have an individual budget, if the budget doesn't grow every year to deal with the cost, then what that budget buys is diminished every single year.
Yeah.
So the first year, it might be kind of okay, but then the next year it won't be.
Every
and
year
so,
after that.
Yeah. So if I have a budget or if I have a rate, if there's not a way of developing a sustainable system.
So how do you develop a system like that? And is AB 279 a part of that process?
I think it's a part of it.
Okay.
It's a step in the right direction. Ultimately, we have to see what comes out of the rate study.
Yeah. That won't be until next year?
March of 2019, 2 years.
2 years, so that's...
2 years. And I just don't think that all of our provider group can sustain and survive.
So what is the role of the regional center? Do you have a responsibility to do something about this funding crisis? And what can parents, advocates, and other members of the community do to help?
I think it's critically important that everyone get involved. The regional center alone cannot fix the rate system or this funding issue. Historically, when we've had change in the system, it's been because families have gotten involved, providers have gotten involved. But I think most importantly is we all have to work together.
Yeah.
I think when we become divisive, we lose the ear of our local legislators. But when we work together and we speak with one message, they hear us and we make headway. The rate system is broken. There's not a lot we can do to get around the broken rate system given the median rates and the fixed rates that can't go up. We can't give rate increases or anything like that. And so we need statutory change. We've argued for a number of years that if they just got rid of the median rate, that we would have room to breathe.
Yeah.
If we could adjust rates based upon economic distress, we would have room to breathe while they work through this whole revamping of the rate system. But in the absence of this room to breathe, I think we're going to have some devastating consequences.
Yeah. Sounds like a really tough climb.
It's more than a climb.
Yeah.
It's like going straight up an elevator shaft with no elevator.
Well, that's it's an interesting visual there. But so with this funding crisis, how are the promises made by the Lanterman Act affected? Could we still keep those promises?
You know, the promises are there. The economics just aren't there. I mean, the words are there, but the
But if you
economics
don't
behind
have-
the words aren't there.
Yes.
And so I think at this point, we still have hope. And I think that we need to cling to that hope. But I also think that families need to get involved. We have to fund the hope. We have to fund the system. If people are to leave, you know, self-determined lives, and if people are to become part of this community, then we need to put resources in for it to happen. You know, clearly when we look at state-run institutions and that cost and what it costs to serve someone in the community, you know, we do it a lot more efficiently in a lot more person-centered way than the state has ever done it. And we've shown better results, I think, than the state has ever shown. So I just believe that the families need to understand where we've come from. You know, where were we 50 years ago? What was available 50 years ago? What's available today? And then how do we ensure our futures for tomorrow? And what we need to do that. And I think it's important that every single person that's involved in this system get out, advocate, and go out to their legislators.
Yeah, it's a great message.
I mean, we really actually started with nothing. When we look at the San Fernando Valley, 50 years ago, we had the ARC, which was here. We had a few scattered programs. I think over the last 50 years, we've coalesced. We've developed a number of supports. Jay Nolan. Actually, I recall meeting with Gary Lavinia when he first was thinking about doing Jay Nolan. We met with him in the Newhall office of the Regional Center. He'd just come up there to kind of figure out where he wanted to kind of start Jay Nolan, and he was going to develop the group homes.
Back in the day.
Oh, way back in the day. Gosh, had to be 78, 77, somewhere around in there. And it was really innovative. It was really innovative. But the good thing about the system is that was innovation. But now when you think about that, it's kind of like, gee, we'd never do that again.
Yeah, no, it's
never do that again. So the beauty of the system is, over the 50 years, we haven't sold the same product. The service and supports that have been offered to consumers has changed. And that's the beauty of our system. And that's what we have to hold on to and preserve, is we can change, we can grow with our families, we can grow with contemporary times that change how we do things. And I think that's really important. And I think the regional centers, if we do what's in the Lanterman Act, we'll grasp onto that and continue to change with the needs of our families and our consumers. So there's a future, but we have to protect it, we have to advocate for it, and we'll all have to speak in one voice to make sure it's going to be there.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me. It was really great to have you.
Well, it's nice of you to have me. I appreciate it. Good luck.
Thank you.